Hey everybody, it's Nick again, and just wanted to do my follow-up video to the video I did previously, and wherein I'm going to talk this time about the games that I played after I played Dungeons and Dragons. So what did I pick up after I played D&D, and then why? Like, how did I find out about those things? Because of course this is an era when uh, finding out about things was not super easy necessarily. So there were particular channels through which you were going to find out about these things, other role playing games. There wasn't a ton of examples of that you could point to of like, oh yeah, here's like this like steady stream of information coming at me about role playing games. There's no internet, right? So you're looking at publications or word of mouth really is what you're looking at, with the possible addition of like if you have a game store near you, which I didn't really until the slightly later 80s, when I moved out to California. Eventually they had a game store in our mall, which I frequented pretty intensely. um, it was called the Gamekeeper, I believe, and it was a chain actually. So you may have had a Gamekeeper in your area if you remember that, like back in the day. And they sold like chess sets and backgammon and things like that, but they also sold role playing games and strategy games and war games and things like that. So they had a whole section for the stuff I was interested in. I'd go look at that, miniature games. They had some of that stuff too. I remember going into one in the early 90s, and by that point, the store was, it was actually the mid 90s. The store was, it had a little bit of D&D stuff, and then the rest of it was just Vampire the Masquerade, pretty much. So, like that, by the 90s, things had changed. But it was a lot more diverse in the 80s. Um, so where did I get how did I get into other games? Well, one of them was through Dragon Magazine, which was a which I was buying. I started buying it when I started playing D&D, and Dragon was a just wonderful source of information for all sorts of gaming stuff. It had articles in there on board games, war games, all sorts of strategy games, mostly oriented toward fantasy. But that's what they talked about in there, and they also had articles on computer games and things like that, reviews of novels and things like that. So I found out about a series that I ended up falling in love with, like fantasy novel series, like by Gene Wolfe, the Book of the New Sun. Like I first found out about that by reading the review in Dragon Magazine. That's a series I really love. But lots of so that was definitely a way to find out about things, was all these articles in Dragon Magazine, and then the ads in Dragon Magazine as well, because they had ads for all these other games. So I'd see these ads for games by Chaosium, I'd see ads for RuneQuest, or I'd see ads for Tunnels and Trolls, which is by Flying Buffalo, or I'd see a whole variety of games by a company called Fantasy Games Unlimited, who did a game called Aftermath, which is an apocalyptic game, and they did another game called Privateers and Gentlemen, and another one, what was the other one? They did one called, did they do Psy World? I think they did Psy World, and Space Opera was another one. So they had all these other games, and I was like, wow, there's all these other games out there, and I was immediately intrigued, right, by the possibility of playing other things other than just fantasy, that you could play in these other genres, right? So like, okay, there's a role playing game for this. Now there's role playing games for these other genres too. Like that sounded like a lot of fun. So it wasn't just about fighting monsters and killing dragons, which was super cool, right? D&D had cornered the market on that, but also there were other fantasy games in there. Like, so it was like, it wasn't just like Dungeons and Dragons. Like RuneQuest was kind of its own thing, and they had ads for just all sorts of stuff in there. So I was drawn into all of this, and it had amazing covers. So Dragon was a really great thing, and it was published by TSR, but they didn't hesitate about covering other games. They really embraced that, and that's something I kind of love about that, was that they really promoted not the entire gaming industry, not just their own stuff. There might have been a little. I think as the magazine went on, maybe there was a slight privileging of TSR material over other things, but but for the most part, especially in the early days, it was pretty agnostic as far as like what it I don't know if that's the right word, but holistic. I don't know. Varied in its approach. Varied in its approach. So it had a lot of. Um, it had its hands or eyes on a lot of different things. And it was good. So the other thing that I found out about Stefan was there was a catalog that came with the basic set, which was the catalog was called The Gateway to Adventure, and it had stuff in there for other games that I was like, oh, these look like a lot of fun. And so I'm going to talk about a few of those games right now. Um, and the one of those games that I saw, like, they had like a lot of role playing games in there. They had all the other editions of D&D that I was kind of like, oh wow, like I think that's probably the first place I ever saw the although it may not have been the first place I saw the original Dungeons and Dragons rules. But I was like, what is that? Like I was a little bit, sort of puzzled by what that was. Um, but I didn't realize that was the original pamphlet that Gary Gygax published in 1974 that had grown this whole thing, and that the basic set and the advanced D&D books had just kind of grown out of that, or were really kind of variations on that. But there was also board games in there too. They had a game called Snit's Revenge and The Awful Green Things from Outer Space, and another game called Divine Right, which I always wanted to get, which looked really cool. There was a King Arthur game called Knights of Camelot. There was a board game that looked cool. Like I would kind of like to have these games now, but like if you go on eBay and look at looking for a copy of Divine Right, you're going to pay like hundreds of dollars for it. So like, alas, probably not on the cards to get a copy of Divine Right. But unless somebody republishes it, which is always a thing, because board games are kind of big now. Um, one of the games that I saw early on here was this game. It was in the Gateway to Adventure thing, and I also saw an ad in Dragon Music Magazine, which was really, the ad was just this cover, really, except it was in color. And so this is it. This is the game here. It's called Top Secret, espionage role playing game for 3 or more players, ages 12 and up, published by TSR The Game Wizards, as they were known. And it's got some charts on the back here, right? And I was like a little intimidated by these charts, but also like kind of excited by them too. I was like, oh wow, this game's going to be really, I'll just like have a lot of detail in it about guns and things and stuff. And I was kind of fascinated by that. But here's the thing about Top Secret was that I didn't really understand the rules, right? It was a little, it said ages 12 and 12 to adult. I think I was maybe 11 when I got this game, and it was still over my head. Like I would have needed somebody to show me how to play this game, and I was not like super math oriented, and it just intimidated me a bit. And so I didn't understand. Here's an example. Let me show you, for example. So I never used the rules. We played this game a ton, and I never used the rules, really. We rolled up characters, and I kind of followed the rules for that, but then the characters never advanced, really. And nothing, they just got more stuff, and I gave them more money, and they got like helicopters and new equipment and things like that. And again, like I said, we played this game for literally years, I think, and the entire time I was not following the rules. I would just have them roll percentile dice, because it came with the D100 percentile dice. So I'd be like, oh, there's like a 30% chance you hit this person, and then you would like roll or whatever. And so like that, and my players never questioned that, and we had a ton of fun playing it. So, but we weren't following the rules. The rules are, again, badly explained. That's not an uncommon thing in some early editions of role-playing games. There are some role-playing games that, even early ones, that are better at it. Like Traveller does a much better job of explaining itself, and RuneQuest certainly does a better job, I think, of explaining itself. But this game was not super intuitive. This is just one example. They had an elaborate set of melee combat tables here for like untrained combat, sword play, knife fighting, boxing, judo, and martial arts. So let me show you the martial arts table here. So here's the martial arts table for Top Secret, which I was looking at this going, what? Okay, so you've got these different things here. You've got like different areas you're hitting, and then also you've also got this wonderful picture down here, which you can see of this guy doing a flying sidekick into this other guy's face. They're very 1970s kind of situation here, right? Like fighting in an alley, right? And they're one guy's got like mutton chops and whatever, and the guy's wearing a yeah. It's just it's a pretty like anyway. But that was supposed to tell you, okay, here's what you can do, this crazy like martial arts stuff, right? If you can figure out how to use the chart, which I couldn't figure out how to use the chart, so alas, that never happened. But I ran a bunch of the modules for the game, and the modules are actually really pretty good. And you could do all kinds of crazy things in the game. You could, we would have adventures where we could send the characters off to like, smuggle somebody out from behind the Iron Curtain, a special Russian scientist who, or you were gonna go and try and get the secret plans. They're being held in an enemy base, right? There was a community that you were going to infiltrate because it's full of enemy spies, right? And try and find out what their operation is there. So there was a lot of that stuff going on, and that game was it took up an inordinate amount of our time. We really enjoyed it, and the characters had again didn't they got all kinds of crazy equipment. Eventually, they had like ridiculous equipment, like military equipment, basically. Like I said, helicopters and vast palatial like apartments, and whatever kind of guns they wanted, and grenades. And one of the characters had his arm blown off, and so I gave him a robotic arm, of course, inevitably. Like of course that's going to happen. So that was a great game. At least it was fun, even though I guess you could say we weren't technically playing the game, but we sure had fun anyway. So we wearing at least the outer shell of Top Secret. We were whatever we were doing, we were having fun. So the other game that was in the Gateway to Adventure set that I really enjoyed was this game here, which I picked up, called Gamma World, which you'll see the picture there. So you've got like these guys with like a guy with like a little tricorder-y thing, and they got all these like different like crazy like laser rifles and stuff with these like energy packs they're being powered by, and then you can see the ruins of this city over here. And that game was that cover, because this is the cover to the rule book, but the box was that in color, and I was immediately sold. I was like, oh, that is going to be fun. And so I just went ahead and I immediately wanted that game. You can play a mutant or a mutant animal, or like a human who survived the disaster. The really interesting thing about the game for me, though, was that it was not a post-apocalypse of our world. It was a post-apocalypse of a science fiction world from the future. So it was like there had been a science fiction society in the future, a high-tech global society that had then had this terrible like catastrophe happen, and it had destroyed itself basically, and all these mutation weapons were utilized globally, and so animals and humans and plants were just completely transformed into these other things. And so it was not a dark apocalypse, right? This was not an apocalypse of like World War III and like gritty realism, or even like things we have today, like apocalyptic stories like The Walking Dead, or things like that. It was a crazy apocalypse, clearly inspired by a lot of media, right? You know, my games were inspired by a lot of media. Clearly, you can. There's a lot of science fiction literature that may be informing Gamma World, but also I think the Ralph Bakshi film Wizards probably bears some of the blame, right? Which is kind of a fantasy apocalypse story that's it's kind of a terrible animated film. Like it's not very good in a lot of ways. But there was really nothing like it at the time, and so Gamma World might draw a little bit from that. The other thing I was really thinking about when I was thinking about Gamma World, though, was I was thinking about the TV show that I loved at the time, which was called Thundar the Barbarian, which was a post-apocalyptic show where there was like sorcery, but it was set 2,000 years after an apocalypse, and there was like the remnants of our society there, but there was all kinds of crazy mutants, and it was worked on by Jack Kirby, who did a lot of the design work on the show, and you can see that really that a lot of the bad guys' vehicles and the bad guy villains and things like that, they're all designed by Kirby. Looks a little bit like his, you know, some of his New God stuff. You can see that kind of bleeding in. And it was kind of referencing one of Kirby's other projects, which would have also made a really good animated kids show, which was a comic book he did for DC called Commandy, the Last Boy on Earth. And so Thunder is kind of like a kind of revamped version of that, right? Done by Ruby Spears in the early '80s, and I was a avid watcher of that show. Um, but yeah, there was Thundar, the Barbarian, Ukla the Mock, and Princess Ariel, who had sorceress powers and was not a mermaid. So anyway, but. So Thunder was a big influence on Gamma World for sure, and I also took a lot of the other media I was being inspired by at the time, like Robotech and things like that, were a big influence. And the third game I just want to talk about just briefly, and I'll probably talk about this one in a little more detail, is this one, which is Traveler. What does it say here? It says, and so look, there's no picture on the cover here, right? It's just kind of graphically designed in this like rather dramatic way. Black box. I actually remember seeing this kid walking around with this box, and I was like, what is that? Because I realized it was a role-playing game because I'd seen the ads in Dragon magazine, but I didn't realize it came in this little tiny box, and I was like super like, oh, that's nifty. Like you can carry the whole game around like this little tiny box. And there's all these little booklets. Like that's all the supplements for these little booklets that went in the box. So the game was like really well thought out in that sense. Also, didn't use any funny dice. It literally just used 2d6. So if you could just grab, 2d6 out of whatever your Monopoly set or whatever, you could play Traveler, right? It came with 2d6. It came with two little white 2 six-sided dice, which are just regular dice. But it has this dramatic kind of thing on the cover here. It says, "This is Free Trader Beowulf, calling anyone. Mayday, mayday, we are under attack. Main drive is gone. Turret number 1 is responding. Mayday, is not responding. Mayday, losing cabin pressure, fast. Calling anyone, please help. This is Free Trader Beowulf. Mayday." That's the cover, right? And that tells you a lot about the game right there. This is, okay, we're going to be on spaceships. Like it's a little bit more realistic science fiction universe. But a lot of people talk about Travelers being like a hard sci-fi game, but it's really an adventure sci-fi game. It's just like, it's looking at space as this thing that's like dangerous and adventurous, and you're going to all these new worlds and exploring these other civilizations and interacting with these other cultures and whatnot. And trying to eke out a living generally while you're doing it. The TV show Firefly owes a lot to Traveler, probably, or at least because Traveler, basically what they're doing on that show basically is what characters do in Traveler. People have talked about that Joss Whedon probably played Traveler at some point back in his day, and so that it might have served as a bit of an inspiration for the show. That's unconfirmed, but I think there's good evidence to point toward that anyway. So if you like Firefly, you might like Traveler. but it's a really good game, and I do want to talk in more detail about that. But I saw the ads for that in Dragon Magazine, of course, and so like where's the Gamma World and Top Secret I had seen in the Gateway to Adventure thing. This was not published by TSR. This is the first my first non TSR game. It was published by a company called Game Designers Workshop, um, which yeah, so Traveler was one of my first games that was not TSR game, and then I went on to buy a lot of other non TSR games. So the next video I'm going to do, I think that's pretty much all I want to talk about that stuff. The next video I'm going to do is about, I'm going to talk a little bit more, I think, about Dungeons and Dragons and some of the older editions that I touched on last time, but I'm talking a little more detail about them. Probably, but this is the last of my like gaming bio stuff. Well, actually, I might do further installments of this because I've got tons more I could talk about because this is really just taking me up until like the mid '80s. And I do want to do another video on Call of Cthulhu, which is another game I bought at the game store that was in my area, the Gamekeeper. I that game changed my whole perspective on role playing games. So when I bought Call of Cthulhu, that's a game I really need to spend a little bit of time talking about. So I'll probably just do a whole video on that maybe. We'll see. So anyway, but that's it for now. So thank you and take care.